If you try to imagine the death of a trillion-dollar decentralized network like Bitcoin, you probably picture this, I don't know, this spectacular Wall Street style
Oh,
crash.
totally. A highly cinematic vision.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Sirens blaring, red charts just plummeting, frantic headlines declaring the sudden fiery collapse of the whole
Oh,
system.
right, because we've been completely conditioned to think that massive financial or tech systems only fail through these sudden catastrophic events.
But our sources today actually suggest a totally different paradigm for you to think about, and frankly, it's a much more insidious threat.
It really is.
Yeah, because Bitcoin isn't necessarily facing a dramatic, fiery collapse. Instead, it's facing the very real possibility of just being quietly abandoned.
Quietly abandoned. Yeah.
Like, imagine a building that doesn't explode, but it just slowly sinks into the mud because the foundation is completely dissolving underneath it.
It's a fascinating premise, especially if you consider how heavily the entire ecosystem relies on this unshakable conviction from its users. So what happens when that conviction slowly evaporates? Not because the math failed, but because nobody can agree on what the math is actually supposed to be doing in the first place.
Exactly. And we have an incredible stack of sources for you today exploring this exact phenomenon. We are pulling from a deeply analytical series of notes, specifically drawing from the Keystone series, part 14.
Yep.
We're also looking at this conceptual piece called Article Omega, which centers around a really interesting metaphor known as the final JPEG.
I love that metaphor. We'll get into that.
Oh, we definitely will. And anchoring all of this is a highly debated proposal known simply as the Genesis Act.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to basically figure out what it actually takes to define a decentralized system before it slips into total irrelevance. We're going to explore why mathematical code, no matter how flawless or cryptographically secure it is, why it simply isn't enough to sustain a network.
And we'll look at why plain human language might actually be the only mechanism capable of saving it, right?
Correct.
Okay, let's unpack this. If people are quietly leaving the network because no one can actually, define what Bitcoin is anymore,
Right.
how do you fix that definition without completely destroying the very thing that makes the system special?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question.
Because the whole ethos of the space from the very, very beginning was that it didn't need human definition, it just needed math. Like, code is law. That was the battle cry.
Right. And code is law is an incredibly powerful rallying cry. But what our sources are pointing out is this massive, existential blind spot in that philosophy.
Okay.
Because while Bitcoin has these incredibly strict mathematically enforced rules, which, that is the code, it critically lacks a clearly stated boundary.
Rules versus a boundary. I want to drill into that for a second.
Sure.
Because it sounds like a semantic distinction, but I know it's actually doing all the heavy lifting in this argument.
It is the absolute core of the issue.
Yeah.
So think about the code as the raw physics of the system, right?
Yeah.
The software dictates exactly how a block is mined, how the cryptographic signatures are verified. It enforces the hard cap of 21 million coins.
Right. The mechanics.
Exactly, the mechanics.
Yeah.
And the network enforces those rules with absolute emotionless ruthlessness. If your transaction doesn't meet the mathematical criteria, the nodes just reject it. Boom. Done.
They don't care who you are.
Exactly. But a boundary is fundamentally different.
Right.
A boundary defines what conceptually belongs within the system and what does not.
Oh, I see.
So without a boundary, everything is technically permissible as long as it fits the math.
Right. It's like showing up to play a game where the referee strictly enforces how you are allowed to pass the ball. Like, that's the code.
Yes.
But no one has actually bothered to paint the out-of-bounds lines on the actual field.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Right, because that missing paint is the missing boundary. You can pass the ball perfectly according to the rules with, mathematically flawless execution. But if someone decides to just run out into the parking lot or into the stands or down the street with the ball, the referee can't blow the whistle.
Nope.
Because technically, the mechanics of the pass were perfectly legal.
Exactly. The referee is meticulously watching the mechanics of the player's hands, but is completely blind to the context of the field itself. And this distinction is absolutely vital here. Code implements rules, but code does not define meaning.
And we are seeing the real-world consequences of that missing meaning right now, aren't we?
Well, absolutely.
Because when the sources talk about the system drifting, they aren't just talking about, abstract philosophy. We've seen actual network upgrades over the last few years.
Right. Things like SegWit and Taproot.
Yeah, SegWit and Taproot. Upgrades that were meant to make financial transactions more efficient. But then Clever developers realized they could use that new data efficiency to embed entirely unrelated things into the blockchain.
Exactly. That's the rise of the Ordinals protocol and BRC-20 tokens. Suddenly, the blockchain isn't just processing decentralized money.
Right. People are inscribing like arbitrary data, text files, PDFs, rudimentary video games.
Reservoir apes.
Yes, thousands of pictures of digital apes, and they are permanently storing them on the ledger.
Forever.
And the node operators, the referees in our sports analogy, they have to process it all because according to the strict mathematical code, the data fits the block size limit and the sender paid the transaction fee. The pass was legal.
The pass was legal, but the player's running through the parking lot.
Exactly.
The code allows it, but is it actually Bitcoin?
Yeah.
That is the crisis of meaning right there. Meaning requires context,
Huh.
a shared understanding,
Right.
a collective agreement on why we are participating in this network in the first place. The quiet abandonment we are talking about happens because users cannot anchor their deep belief to a system that needs everything and nothing all at once.
Because if the definition of the network just becomes an open database for whatever random data fits mathematically into a block, then it has no core identity as a monetary revolution anymore. It's just an incredibly inefficient cloud hard drive.
Precisely. And people might stay for a while out of habit or, because they're financially speculating on the latest meme token inscribed on the chain.
Sure, speculation is huge.
But speculation is fickle. People don't dedicate their lives, their energy, or their core ideological belief to a digital junk drawer.
A digital junk drawer, wow, yeah.
Right. If the system is just a boundless container, they quietly wander off to find a game that actually makes sense.
So if the field is missing its out-of-bounds lines, and the core players are starting to leave because the game has just turned into complete chaos, we need a solution.
Yes.
And that brings us to the central, highly controversial mechanism proposed in our source material, which is the Genesis Act.
The proposed solution to finally draw those lines.
But, okay, I'm looking at this from the perspective of a hardcore network participant.
Okay.
And the moment you propose something called the Genesis Act, all the alarm bells start ringing.
Oh, for sure. It sounds terrifying to them.
It sounds like a mandate from a central bank. It sounds like an attempt to establish, I don't know, a supreme foundation or a policy board or some centralized governance committee to dictate what people can and cannot do.
Right.
And that goes against the entire permissionless ethos of the system.
It absolutely does. But what's fascinating here is that the Genesis Act is explicitly designed to be the exact opposite of centralized governance.
Wait, really?
Really. The sources place incredibly strict constraints on what this act can actually be. It is not an attempt to create a leadership board. It does not hand out authority to anyone.
Okay, so what is it?
It is simply a prose declaration.
A prose declaration? You mean just like plain text?
Yes, human language. And English paragraph for just a few concise sentences. It is a plain language definition of the network's boundary. And critically, the sources emphasize that it is explicitly not code.
But, okay, how does an English paragraph actually stop a decentralized mathematical network from processing unwanted data? Like, if the code is a machine, the Genesis Act sounds like a philosophical instruction manual.
That's a good way to put it.
How do you force a global network of computers to read the manual?
Well, you don't force the computers to read it. You rely on the humans running the computers.
Ah.
Remember, the software doesn't write itself, and it doesn't run itself either. A decentralized network is ultimately maintained by thousands of individual human node operators.
Right.
So if those human operators collectively agree on a plain language definition, for instance, if they agree, the Genesis Act states that Bitcoin is strictly a peer-to-peer electronic cash system and explicitly not an arbitrary data storage protocol.
Then that social consensus dictates what happens next.
Exactly. The social consensus dictates it.
I see. So the social consensus precedes the code.
100%.
Okay.
If the humans agree on the plain language boundary, they will demand, write, and run specific software updates that enforce that exact boundary.
So they'll run a version of the code that literally says, reject transactions containing arbitrary PDF files, even if they pay the fee.
Exactly. Because the code is downstream of human belief. We have spent, the last decade and a half glorifying the math.
Yeah.
We've glorified the cold, trustless nature of cryptography.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources are making a profound point here. The ultimate survival of this hyper-advanced technological network depends on something as ancient and messy as human prose.
That is wild.
Because humans do not fundamentally rally behind software updates. They rally behind shared beliefs.
Yeah.
If you cannot articulate what you are defending in plain language, you cannot defend it against drift.
Okay, so the Genesis Act is the mechanism. It's the act of painting the lines on the field.
Right.
But what does that boundary actually look like once it's finished and agreed upon? Because the source material refers to this end state as Article Omega, or the final JPEG.
The final JPEG. It's a very striking piece of symbolism in the literature.
And to be clear for you listening, since we are literally just talking about people storing digital art in actual JPEGs on the blockchain via ordinals, the sources are not talking about an image file here.
No, no, no.
The final JPEG is just a metaphor.
Correct. It has nothing to do with literal image files on the ledger. It's an analogy for finality. So think about the process of creating a complex digital image in a program like, say, Photoshop.
Okay.
You might have a file with 100 different layers. You have vectors, text layers, background colors. You can endlessly tweak them, move things around, hide layers, add new ones. The state of the image is completely fluid, right? It's open to interpretation.
Right. It can be whatever you want it to be on any given day.
Exactly. But at some point, you have to decide that the image is finished. You flatten all of those independent fluid layers down into a single compressed file.
You export it.
You export it as a JPEG. Once it's a JPEG, the pixels are permanently set. The image is locked.
Okay, I see.
The final JPEG represents total historical finality of definition. It marks the precise moment where the system permanently stops expanding its meaning.
I understand the thrust of the metaphor, but I'm actually going to push back on it a bit.
Okay, go for it.
Because JPEGs are entirely rigid. They are static data. But as we just discussed, the boundary we're trying to create is made of human language, an English prose document.
Right.
And human language is famously squishy. Words change meaning, contexts evolve over time.
They do.
So isn't there a fundamental tension in trying to create a static, rigid boundary out of something as interpretive as prose?
That is a highly perceptive critique, and it cuts right to the vulnerability of the entire concept. Language is inherently interpretive. But the proponents of Article Omega argue that the intent of the finality is what actually matters.
The intent.
Right. The goal isn't necessarily to write a sentence so mathematically perfect that it can never ever be misinterpreted. The goal is a collective psychological shift.
A shift from an open-ended project to a completed one.
Yes. Bitcoin has to stop being a sandbox. If it continues to be this constantly expanding experiment trying to be 100 different layers for 100 different use cases.
Like money, smart contracts, data storage, digital identity.
Exactly. If it tries to be all those things, it loses all structural integrity. Only when the definition is fixed, even with the inherent imperfections of language, can users finally anchor their belief.
Right.
You cannot anchor your life savings or your philosophical worldview to a liquid that is constantly changing shape. You need a solid foundation.
So the final JPEG is just the moment the community looks at the network and says, this is what it is, and more importantly, this is what it will never be.
And that psychological finality is what halts the silent exodus of users.
It makes complete logical sense. The mechanics of it check out. And there's a big but here. Once you establish that this final plain language boundary is necessary, an unavoidable, massive elephant in the room question arises.
Oh, yeah.
And we can't ignore it.
I know exactly where you're taking this.
Who gets to decide that boundary?
Yep.
Who actually gets to hold the paintbrush and draw the out-of-bounds lines? Because if we aren't relying on an automated algorithm to decide and we need a human prose document, some human or group of humans has to actually sit down and write it.
That is the crux of the entire issue. And it's exactly where the concept of the Genesis Act faces its greatest friction.
Naturally.
But the proposal does not answer this question by declaring an authority. It doesn't, hand you a list of trusted names. Instead, the Genesis Act is framed as a call.
A call for what?
A call for a Bitcoin constitutional convention.
Okay, I can practically hear the collective shudder from anyone deeply involved in decentralized tech listening to this right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Constitutional convention. It sounds like the absolute antithesis of a peer-to-peer network.
It triggers a deeply visceral defensive reaction.
It really does, because historically, constitutional conventions evoke images of, smoky back rooms.
Right, politicians in powdered wigs.
Yeah.
Or, in the modern context, a bunch of tech billionaires, elite developers, and massive mining pool executives sitting in a closed-door boardroom in Switzerland, right?
Oh, yeah.
Centralizing control over the network to serve their own financial interests. It sounds like a corporate coup. It absolutely sounds like a coup. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources provide a very powerful, highly uncomfortable counterargument to that fear.
Okay.
We have to expose a hidden truth about Bitcoin that the community often completely refuses to acknowledge.
Which is what?
Bitcoin already has governance.
Wait, you mean beyond the automated consensus algorithm?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The governance is already there. It is just hidden.
Huh.
And because it's hidden, it is incredibly vulnerable to drift. Decisions are being made constantly about what code gets merged into the software repository, what software updates the major mining pools will signal for, and how the network should adapt to things like ordinals.
But those decisions are happening in the shadows.
Exactly.
Yep.
Often obscured by deeply technical jargon under the guise of, well, we are just following the math.
Ah. So when people say code is law, they conveniently forget that humans have the commit keys to the GitHub repository where the code actually lives. Humans are making judgment calls every single day, but no one is taking explicit accountability for the overarching direction of the system because they can just hide behind the illusion of a purely mathematical process.
Yes. It's shadow governance by technocracy.
Wow.
And the call for a constitutional convention isn't about creating leaders where none existed. It is about forcing the community to consciously, explicitly recognize the governance that is already happening in the dark.
It's about dragging it out into the light.
Dragging it out into the light. It's forcing the ecosystem to be honest with itself. Stop pretending the machine is running itself. We are driving it. We need to agree on a destination.
Yeah. It's saying we must decide this boundary consciously, together, out in the open, rather than letting the system drift into irrelevance behind closed developer doors.
Precisely. It's not about centralization. It's about transparency and conscious consensus.
So practically speaking, how does this actually play out? Because obviously, a constitutional convention for a global decentralized network isn't going to happen in a physical convention center in Miami with delegates wearing little name tags.
Oh, definitely not.
Where does the debate actually happen? How do you form consensus without a central voting booth?
You have it in the only place a decentralized network truly exists. The grassroots reality is that this convention starts exactly where you are right now.
Online.
Online. It happens in open source repositories, on development mailing lists, and thousands of forum threads, on podcasts, and on social media.
We've actually seen precedent for this, haven't we? Like years ago during the block size wars.
Oh, that's a great example.
The community essentially had a massive distributed civil war over the rules, culminating in what was called a user-activated soft fork. It wasn't decided in a boardroom. It was decided by thousands of everyday node operators just refusing to yield.
That is the perfect historical parallel. A distributed convention is messy, it's chaotic, and it's loud. But it is driven by everyday people, developers, and node operators who recognize the fundamental problem of the missing boundary. It is driven by people who see that the field has no out-of-bounds lines, who see the drift, and who feel a personal calling to step up and solve it.
So synthesizing everything we've pulled from the Keystone series and Article Omega today, this Genesis Act isn't some corporate master plan being rolled out from the top down.
Not at all.
It is an invitation to the grassroots. The ultimate irony here is that Bitcoin doesn't need a single line of new revolutionary code to survive its current crisis.
No.
What it desperately needs is a boundary. And that boundary can only be drawn by a community that realizes it has the power and, frankly, the terrifying responsibility to use human language to define exactly what it is they are protecting.
It requires immense courage to step away from the safety of the math and embrace the responsibility of meaning.
And that brings us directly to you, the listener, because whether you are heavily invested in cryptography, maybe you're running your own node, or you are just someone fascinated by how complex human systems survive over time, the lesson here is deeply universal.
It really is.
Even the most mathematically perfect systems, the most rigorous, trustless architectures ever designed, they ultimately rely on human meaning to survive.
They have to.
If you don't define your boundaries in plain, understandable language, your community won't spectacularly revolt. They won't burn the building down in a fiery, dramatic crash.
Yeah.
They will simply look around, realize they don't know what game they're playing anymore, and quietly leave the field.
But this raises an incredibly important question, a final thought for you to take away and just sort of mull over.
Let's hear it.
If Bitcoin's ultimate survival relies on a fixed, plain language boundary that users consciously agree upon today, that final JPEG of definition we talked about, what happens 50 years from now?
When the people who wrote that definition are gone, And a completely new generation inherits the system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because as we discussed earlier, human language and culture are not static code. They constantly evolve.
Right. Words shift in meaning. Cultural contexts transform completely.
So can a prose boundary ever truly be permanent across generations? Or is the survival of a decentralized system inherently cyclical?
Oh, wow.
Will every future generation have to undergo their own silent crisis of meaning to rediscover, debate, and redefine those out-of-bounds lines all over again?
It really makes you rethink the whole concept of permanence, doesn't it?
It really does.
We came to this deep dive looking for a clean, binary answer from a mathematical system. And what we found instead is that the murky, complicated, ever-changing world of human language might be the only thing holding it all together.